and welcome to the 2023 Leading Transformational Change Forum, sponsored by One Business World. And I am Cheryl Brinkley, and I will be moderating this session for our speaker of the day, Shannon Wallis. Shannon Wallis is the founder of Cascade Leadership, which collaborates with leaders, their teams, internal consultants, and coaches to design sustainable solutions that flow throughout organizations and drive transformational change. Before she was a leadership consultant, Shannon headed up the Global High Potential Leadership Development Program at Microsoft. In addition to running Cascade Leadership, Shannon is also a board member for United Planet. Today, Shannon will be walking us through the DVFR Formula, and with that, I will hand it over to Shannon.
Thank you, Cheryl. And thank you, Stelios and Ian, for sponsoring the Leading Transformational Change Forum. I'm truly delighted to not only participate as a speaker, but also to hear from all of the distinguished thought leaders this week. I know that many of you are probably like me. You have a goal that you haven't yet achieved. And I want you to think about that goal now, just for a few moments, and ask yourself, what really got in the way? Where is your resistance coming from? Because I had a goal like that once myself, and it eluded me for not one, not two, but for 3 years. And I did achieve it. And I, non-hiker, non-athlete, completely a couch potato, walked 500 miles or 800 kilometers across northern Spain along a route called El Camino de Santiago. I want to share what I learned about overcoming my own resistance, the story of that, what I discovered in the process that helped me both personally and professionally with my clients and their organizations, and how I think it could help you as well. My story begins in June 1999. I was at a leadership development retreat in Northern California. I was walking through the woods, and suddenly I had this sense that something was trying to get my attention. And I looked up and I saw a break in the tree branches. And when I saw that break, I also saw rays of sun streaming through. And I can't explain it, but I had this knowingness that I would go to northern Spain and do something spiritual. I had been called, but I did not know what to. I returned home to Atlanta, Georgia, and Joe, my husband of 2 years, 2 months. And I said to Joe, we're moving to Spain. And Joe, quite remarkably, just looked at me a bit confused, probably wondering if I had picked up something other than just a few souvenirs in Northern California, and said, tell me more. And I said, I can't explain it. I have to go to Northern Spain and do something spiritual. I don't know what it is, but I need to go. Now, Joe is a Naval Academy graduate. He was a Marine. At that time, he was a reservist, enjoying his post-Marine active duty career. And in that time, when he just looked at me with a bit of confusion, he just nodded and he said, all right. And our journey began. 2 months later, I was asked to interview for the chief of staff role to the president of Central Europe and Eurasia for Coca-Cola. Now, that was a really highly coveted role. And I didn't think it would go to me because usually it goes to somebody in finance or marketing, but I decided to interview anyway. And I was completely surprised when they offered it to me, an organizational change consultant. So I got the job. Joe left his job at Accenture and we moved to Vienna, Austria, November 16th, 1999. I was so excited. And 2 weeks into the job, Coke CEO resigned because the board had lost confidence in his leadership. I didn't think it was going to impact me. I was completely naive. But 4 weeks later, and literally 3 days after my furniture arrived, the president of Central Europe and Eurasia, my boss, was terminated by the newly appointed CEO, probably due to political or irreconcilable differences. But as his job went, so did mine. And suddenly Joe and I were both out of jobs sitting in Vienna, Austria. Now, I know the sensible thing to do would have been to go back to Atlanta and try to get our old jobs back. But we really wanted to make it work in Europe. So a friend of mine arranged an interview for me in London with her company. And when I went to go meet with the hiring manager happened to tell me she had just returned from a sabbatical. And I asked her, what did you do on that sabbatical? And she said, I walked El Camino de Santiago. Now, I can't explain it, but again, I had this moment of, I'm going to go do that. And I had no idea what she was talking about. So quite calmly, belying my excitement, I looked at her and I said, what is that thing, the Camino? And she described a 500-mile medieval footpath that crossed northern Spain. It started in the Pyrenees Mountains in the French-Spanish border, crossed west to Santiago de Compostela, which is believed to be the burial place of St. James, one of Jesus's 12 disciples. Now, at that time, I couldn't imagine doing something like this, but I finally had my vision of my calling. It was February of 2000, 9 months after receiving that calling, and I knew I would walk El Camino de Santiago. I returned to Vienna, and you would think, oh, Shannon, didn't you just drop everything and go right away? Of course not, because I still had to close out my job. I had myriad complications associated with that. But Joe eventually found a job in Madrid, and we moved in September of 2000 to Madrid, Spain. Now, once we got there, Joe had taken a job with a consulting firm, but within a few months, he wasn't really satisfied with that role, so he accepted another role with a friend's company to be their European representative and start up the European office. He had worked with the founders in the United States. We both felt really optimistic about the opportunity. And as we were starting that, there was one catch. It was 100% commission, but we had saved some of my Coca-Cola severance package. So we thought it'll be okay until we discovered I was pregnant. So we were totally delighted, but we wanted a more predictable income. And Joe, being a reservist, could do a 3-month assignment at Camp Lejeune, North Carolina in the United States. So when that happened in June of 2001, now 2 years after my calling, Joe boarded a plane to Camp Lejeune, North Carolina. The same morning, I went to my doctor to have my regular trimester visit, and he looked at me and he said, Shannon, I am so sorry, but I can't find the heartbeat. And my world kind of disintegrated in that moment, and I had no way of even informing Joe. And that summer ended up being very painful and very long. But as it came to a close, I began to look forward to Joe's return on September 15th. When 9/11 happened, Joe was already on active duty and he was mobilized. It was a really hard time, but before he had to go to his next assignment, he was able to come and spend a couple of days with me. And in that process, I got pregnant again, and we were completely delighted. I knew I would be alone during this time, but I was really looking forward to our future family. And my doctor assured me it was highly unlikely that I would have another miscarriage. Unfortunately, he was wrong, and I miscarried the second time in December of 2001. I was able to see Joe for a couple of days over the holidays. And when that happened on New Year's Eve, I remember Joe raising a glass to give us a toast. And he said, you know, Shannon, it's been a very tough year, but it can't get any worse. Clink. My stomach turned over because I just had this sense something really bad is coming. And 2 days later, my mom called and she said to me, Shannon, I have cancer. And I started to cry. And she said, oh, honey, don't worry. It's only stage 1. The doctor hasn't even scheduled the surgery for another 4 weeks. So I flew to Seattle to help my mom through the recovery of her surgery. And stage 1 cancer actually turned out to be stage 4 cancer that required months of chemo and radiation. So I spent time with her during that time. And when the chemo was nearly over, I returned to my home in Madrid. It was May 2002. I started reading all of the books I had collected over the years about the Camino. And in June of 2002, 3 years after my calling, Joe came home for 1 month of leave. That's vacation to us civilians. And Joe noticed those books. And he said to me one day, Shannon, I noticed all the books on your side of the bed about the Camino. Are you planning to walk it? And I froze. And I wondered in milliseconds, am I planning to walk it? Why am I reading all of these books? This has been a terrible year. We haven't had any time together. I should be wanting to spend time with Joe. We should be starting our family again. And Joe quite quietly said to me, I want you to go. And my world came apart because Joe knows me better than anybody else. Joe knows all of my secrets. He knows how I hid my shame around being raised in a family with mental health issues, alcoholism, abuse, abandonment, and poverty. He also knows how I overcame it. I was the hero child, the super achiever, the kid who worked 3 jobs to be the first person in her family to graduate from college. But in that moment, Joe knew what I hadn't seen. I was truly broken. He would never suggest that I go unless these circumstances were dire. And I knew broken leads to mental health issues, abandonment, and poverty. My identity as the hero child shattered. Amazingly, I was on the Camino 2 weeks later, walking through the Pyrenees. Now, I know we could all say that, of course, it didn't, you weren't going to get there. There were a lot of things that were going on. But finally, there were 3 elements in place that caused me to overcome my resistance. Because during that 2.5 years, I could have gone. There were many times I could have gone. I know that to be true, but I didn't. But I needed these 3 things. These 3 things are vision of the future, dissatisfaction with your current state, and first steps to move from that dissatisfaction to your vision, to overcome your resistance to change. David Gleicher's DVFR model of change. And I want to tell you a little more about that. And let me just show it to you, okay? So as I said, I could have, in many, many occasions, gone through the process of going, but I didn't. But I finally arrived at that space in the Pyrenees Mountains because these 3 pieces were in place. And what was exciting about that time was that I didn't know this yet, but I was really, truly ready to go. I didn't know how the Camino was going to help me overcome my existential crisis, but I knew that something was needed. And obviously, Joe, with his support, knew I needed it as well. So Gleicher's model, 3 elements to overcome your resistance to change. First thing is a vision of the future. Next is your dissatisfaction with the current state times your first steps. Now notice this is a multiplication equation. If any one of these is 0, the product is 0 and it is not greater than resistance to change, you don't overcome the resistance. You absolutely have to have it. So in my case, at first, I had this calling. It was kind of nebulous. It was a bit of a fantasy. I didn't really know what I was called to, just something spiritual in northern Spain. When I heard about the vision in February of 2000 of walking El Camino de Santiago, I finally had that element. I knew where I was going, but I still lacked dissatisfaction. Oh yeah, I lost my job, but hey, I had a loving husband. I was living in Europe, and I just didn't have enough going on to make me fully dissatisfied. It wasn't until I had lost my job and my husband was mobilized and I had 2 miscarriages and my mother's life was threatened with stage 4 cancer and my identity was shattered that I had dissatisfaction with a capital D. And when Joe arrived home and said, I want you to go, I had my first steps, the first support to overcome my resistance to change. Now, you might think it's just me, but when I talk to leaders in my clients and I ask them, when did a change fail? They can always point to one of these elements and say it was missing. And when I ask them, when did you succeed? Everyone was present. And we have cases that abound in the business world. Kodak had the vision of the first digital camera, but didn't have enough dissatisfaction, thought their business was still in paper and film. Coca-Cola, well, remember that newly appointed CEO? He lasted 4 years. He came in with a lot of first steps. He was going to reduce global headcount by 20%, but he never presented a vision of where Coca-Cola should be going. The board lost confidence in him. They brought in another CEO who brought that vision. Blockbuster, it had dissatisfaction. It actually knew what it needed to do, and it failed in its strategic planning. It didn't have the first steps to truly overcome its own resistance to change. Each one of these organizations has struggled, and in some cases are shadows of their former selves. So I want you to think now, go back to that goal that you had at the beginning, the one that you've been having a challenge with, overcoming your own resistance. Think about your vision. Can you really see yourself in the outcome? Have you spent time imagining what that future state might look like? What about dissatisfaction? Are you really dissatisfied? If you don't complete this, how will you feel in 10 years? What mess will you have created in the process? Maybe that will help with some dissatisfaction. For your first steps, do you know who your first supporters are? Is there a first step you could take that will help move you along the path to overcoming your resistance, achieving your goal, launching your big idea, and creating your new reality? I want to hear from you now. What questions do you have?
Shannon, first question. You had a calling while walking through the woods. Can you share more about how you work with clients to help them identify their calling and a clear vision?
Yeah, so I do a lot of, so thank you for the question, Cheryl. And in the process of trying to enable organizations, both individual and teams that I work with, to come up with a new vision, I have a lot of tools. And in fact, I include many of those tools in my book in the workbook section at the very end. I will do things like guided visualization exercises to put them into that state of being more receptive to vision. And then I have a series of questions that I ask them around what is going on in your environment, what's happening with your customers, what is the big idea, what do you want your customers to say, what would you like your peers to say about how you're working together, what outcome do you really want to get? So we'll take a look through a lot of different environmental scans to see what could be on the horizon to help them get their mind thinking in a slightly different way. And I found that to be very, very helpful.
Fantastic.
What other questions are emerging? I will share, Cheryl, that I often hear when it comes to dissatisfaction, it's interesting, about 25% of our population is more vision oriented. 75% is more current reality oriented, but people still have a hard time sometimes getting over their own dissatisfaction. So one of my favorite tools is the 10-10-10 exercise. And I alluded to that already in the questions that I asked. So if you think about where you're at today, and if you don't want to move forward, 10 minutes from now, if you decide to not move towards your vision, where will you be? And how will you feel? 10 months from now, where will you be? And how will you feel? And then finally, 10 years from now, where will you be and how will you feel? And it's usually that 10-year period when I haven't overcome my resistance to make that change. That's when people kind of think to themselves, this is not going to be the future that I want. What other questions are emerging?
Question in the chat. What's going on with you and Joe today?
Oh, great question. So Joe has been a continual support for me. We've been married nearly 25 years. This is what's truly amazing. We've been married nearly 25 years. We now have 2 daughters, and my mother is a more than 20-year cancer survivor. She had a 5% chance of living 5 years, and it's been over 20 years. So we are doing well outside of Seattle, Washington. And we support each other. I think that's the key. We support each other.
The beautiful silver lining to your story. Okay, next question. Overcoming the resistance of dissatisfaction, it will always push back. So how to deal with it?
Well, yes, it does push back. And that's where I think it becomes really important to have those first supporters. I mean, honestly, the first steps, I always, with my clients, do a stakeholder mapping because none of us go it alone. And we have more support than we realize. And so looking at our stakeholders first, who's surrounding us, who could be a support, who's been my champion in the past, can be critically important. In fact, I think this model that has evolved over time by, it started with Gleicher, moved to Beckard, moved to Dannemiller. I think there's an element that's missing, which is support. I think it should be D times V times F times S. Overcomes resistance to change. So look for your supporters because all you really need is one person saying, I want you to do this. I want you to go. And that can make all the difference.
Beautiful. Next question. How would you characterize fear within resistance?
Such an interesting question because I definitely think it can be a motivator. I mean, honestly, for me, my dissatisfaction really came from that moment of fear, of panic, that something was so irreparably broken that we couldn't move forward. Joe, like I said, would never have said, go take a month, the only month that I have with you in the next year, and walk the Camino. So that caused me to panic. But I also had his support. I think if he had come back and the question had, if he'd said, Shannon, why are you reading those books? And then there had been oh, that's interesting. I would never have gone. I needed that additional momentum. I would have still been quite shaken, but I wouldn't have gone at that time. So I think fear can be a motivator. And my hope for my clients is that they don't get to that point of panic. Like we can mine for dissatisfaction without having to get into fear. Just need to be a little nervous, maybe a little anxious, but not fearful.
Okay. Next question. How can you maintain motivation for the second step when facing setbacks after the initial flurry of activity?
Oh, this is such a great question. And this goes back to, is your vision compelling enough? Is your dissatisfaction compelling enough that if you know what those next steps are, that you'll keep moving toward it? It took me about 2 years to write my book. I had contributed to 6 books prior to writing it. And my book is about my experience of walking the Camino and how I use it as a metaphor for change. And I talk about the DVFR model in it, for example, but there are a lot of other lessons in there. And there were multiple times in the process of writing it that I thought about stopping. And I kept coming back to, originally, it had only started as a love letter to my daughters. How can I help them overcome resistance to a change in their own lives? How do I help them launch their big ideas? Because my mom had had a stroke 7 years ago. And I thought, if something like that happened to me, will I have passed on what I've learned? And when I told my friends that I was writing this book just for my daughters, they started saying to me, "Oh, could I read it? I'd really like to read that too." And then that's when I became serious about it. So I knew, having those supporters around me, I felt like they're counting on me. And so that's where I think, when you have that moment when everything seems to be going wrong, go back to your supporters, go back to your plan, have faith, reach out to somebody. You're meeting so many transformational leading, consultants and coaches who know how to lead transformational change in this forum. Reach out to them, reach out to me, because we can usually help you get you over that hump.
That's wonderful. And so all questions have been answered at this time. So I'll kick it back to you for closing.
Thank you, Cheryl. Again, Stelios and Ian, I really, really appreciate your support for this. I'd like to share just one final slide. I've referenced this before already. If you have more questions that you need answered, you can take a look at my book, We the Change, Launching Big Ideas and Creating New Realities, or go to my free Cascade Leadership app. I don't advertise on it. I don't do push notifications. It's really meant for my friends and clients and colleagues, to help them have a resource library around how they can be more effective leaders and overcome their own resistance to launch their big ideas and create their new realities. So please feel free to reach out to me directly. You can find me on LinkedIn, of course, or at my website, www.cascadeleadership.solutions. And you can see the QR code there if you'd like to connect with me on LinkedIn. So thank you so much, Cheryl. Thank you, Stelios and Ian. I really appreciate the opportunity to bring my ideas to this forum. And remember, again, you just need one person saying, "You've got this. I want you to go."
Well, I hope that you can see all the applause coming into the space at this time. And we want to say thank you, Shannon, for that amazing presentation. Very vulnerable and very transparent. And as Shannon mentioned, you can learn more about the steps that you can take to launch a personal transformational change in her book, We the Change, Launching Big Ideas and Creating New Realities. And as she mentioned, you can connect with her through her company website, cascadeleadershipsolutions.com. Thank you, Shannon, for such an inspiring presentation. And thank you for joining us today for this amazing presentation.
Thank you, Cheryl.